I sat at the defense table, listening to my own brother tell a room full of strangers that I was mentally unstable. He wasn't saying it directly. Trevor was too smart for that. He let his high-priced lawyer, a man who smelled like expensive cigars and arrogance, do the dirty work. The lawyer stood in the center of the aisle, holding up a stack of my private bank statements like they were evidence of a crime. He called me financially reckless. He used the word delusional. He told the judge that I had squandered our family's inheritance on a lifestyle I couldn't afford, while Trevor sat there, nodding slowly, looking like a grieving saint. I looked back at the gallery. My parents were sitting directly behind Trevor. My mother wouldn't even meet my eyes. She was busy smoothing out the wrinkles in her designer skirt, looking disgusted that she had to be associated with a mess like me. My father was worse. He was looking at Trevor with pride, the kind of look I hadn't seen directed at me in over a decade. They had already decided I was the villain. They hadn't asked for my side of the story. They just took the polished, narrated lies Trevor fed them because it was easier to believe I was a failure than to admit their golden son was a thief. Your Honor, the lawyer's voice dropped to a mock-sympathetic whisper. Morgan Hale is not just a danger to this estate. She is a person who has lost her grip on reality. We aren't just asking for the assets to be frozen. We are asking for a full court-mandated audit of her life. We want her out of the family home by the end of the week. She has turned a legacy into a landfill. A few people in the back of the room actually snickered. I felt the heat crawl up my neck, but I kept my spine pressed hard against the back of my chair. Trevor finally turned his head. He looked at me, and for a split second, the mask slipped. He didn't look sad. He looked hungry. He leaned over and whispered just loud enough for me to hear. I told you I'd take everything, Morgan. You should have stayed in your place. I looked at his smug, polished face, the face of the boy I used to protect from bullies, now turned into the man who was trying to bury me alive. I didn't cry. I didn't shout. I just picked up my pen and wrote a single word on my legal pad. Wait. Trevor thinks this is a simple robbery. He thinks he's here to take my money and my reputation in one clean strike. He's so blinded by his own ego that he hasn't realized he walked right into a trap. They think this is about money. It isn't. It's about the one thing Trevor can't buy, the truth. I've always been the shadow in the Hale family. Growing up, Trevor was the son, the golden boy who could do no wrong, while I was the girl who stayed quiet, kept the books, and made sure the bills were paid. My parents, Elias and Beatrice, didn't value intelligence unless it was loud. They didn't value loyalty unless it came with a trophy. Trevor understood that early on. He learned that if you speak with enough conviction, people will believe your lies even when the truth is staring them in the face. I was the one who stayed up late reconciling the family business accounts while Trevor was out making connections at country clubs on the company dime. I didn't mind the work. I liked the silence of numbers. They don't lie. They don't betray you. Public humiliation is Trevor's favorite weapon because he knows it's the one thing I can't fight with a spreadsheet. He knows that the more people who see me fail, the more real that failure becomes to our parents. In our world, reputation is the only currency that matters. If you lose your money, you're a tragedy. If you lose your reputation, you're a ghost. Trevor isn't just trying to take my inheritance, he's trying to erase my existence. He wants me to be the cautionary tale told at dinner parties, the sister who lost her mind and blew the family fortune. Sitting here in this courtroom, I feel the weight of every time I stayed silent to keep the peace. Every time Trevor took credit for my ideas, I said nothing. Every time he borrowed money from the trust and I covered the hole, I said nothing. My silence was meant to be my strength, a way to protect the family from Trevor's recklessness. But as I look at the back of my father's head, I realize my silence was actually my cage. It gave Trevor the space to build a false narrative where he is the savior and I am the parasite. The air in the room feels thin. I can feel the eyes of the court reporter on me, probably wondering why I look so hollow. They see a woman who has lost everything. They don't see the years of small, quiet heartbreaks that led to this. They don't see the nights I spent crying in my car because my father forgot my birthday but bought Trevor a new boat the same week. I am vulnerable here, stripped of my dignity in a public forum, but there is a coldness settling into my bones that Trevor hasn't accounted for. He thinks I'm silent because I'm broken. He doesn't realize that for the first time in my life, I'm not staying quiet to protect the family. I'm staying quiet to let him finish digging his own grave. I'm waiting for him to tell one lie too many. My vulnerability isn't a weakness, it's the bait. The dynamic of the Hale family was never about love, it was about branding. To the outside world, we were the perfect American success story, 3 generations of wealth, impeccable manners, and a legacy that seemed untouchable. But inside the walls of our home, the air was different. It was a hierarchy where Trevor sat at the right hand of my father, and I was the ghost who haunted the hallways, expected to be useful but never seen. Trevor was the golden child, a title he wore like a suit of armor. From the moment he could talk, he was groomed to take over the empire. He was rewarded for his boldness, even when that boldness was just a mask for his cruelty. My parents, Elias and Beatrice, were obsessed with appearances to the point of sickness. If a problem couldn't be solved with a donation or a press release, they simply acted like it didn't exist. And in their eyes, I was a problem that refused to be polished. I remember a dinner when I was 22. I had just finished my degree in finance, graduating at the top of my class. I tried to show my father a proposal to modernize the family's investment portfolio, to move away from the dying industries he clung to. He didn't even look at the binder. He just handed it to Trevor and told him to fix whatever mess your sister wrote. Trevor didn't read it either. He threw it in the trash the moment our parents left the room and laughed. "Stick to the chores, Morgan," he had said, his eyes glinting with that familiar entitlement. "The big decisions are for the men who actually carry the name." He ignored the fact that I was the one who actually understood the mechanics of our wealth. He assumed the money would always be there because it always had been, like a faucet that never ran dry. Because I was the responsible one, I was the one who was eventually given the keys to the back office. Not as an executive, but as a glorified bookkeeper. They excluded me from the board meetings, the steak dinners, and the strategic planning, but they expected me to make sure the wires cleared and the taxes were filed. It was the perfect setup for Trevor. He realized early on that since I was the only one looking at the numbers, I was the only one who could stop him, or the only one who could be blamed if things went wrong. He started small, diverting funds for consulting fees that were really just payments for his gambling debts and failed real estate ventures. When I tried to warn my father, he shut me down with a coldness that still stings. "Don't be jealous of your brother's ambition, Morgan," he told me, not even looking up from his paper. "He's trying to grow this family while you're just trying to count pennies." That was the moment I realized that my parents weren't just blinded by Trevor, they were complicit. They needed him to be the hero so they could feel like they had succeeded as parents. They would rather go broke believing his lies than face the truth that their son was a fraud. So, they pushed me out. They signed documents Trevor put in front of them without reading them, effectively stripping me of my authority while keeping my name on the legal filings. They didn't know that by excluding me, they were giving Trevor the rope he needed to hang all of us. He thought he was being clever, moving money through accounts I supposedly controlled, setting a paper trail that led straight to my door. He didn't think I was watching. He didn't think the quiet bookkeeper was keeping a second set of books, ones that didn't just track the money, but tracked every single lie he told to get it. The first time I saw the filing, I wasn't in a courtroom. I was at my kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee, staring at a notification on my phone. It was a digital alert from the county clerk's office, a civil suit filed against me for breach of fiduciary duty and systematic embezzlement. The plaintiff wasn't a business partner or a disgruntled vendor. It was Trevor. He hadn't even called me. He let the automated system of the state of New York deliver the blow. Within minutes, my inbox began to chime with the digital equivalent of a firing squad. Trevor didn't stop at the legal filing. He wanted me to feel the walls closing in. He sent a text that simply read, "Check the news soon, sis. I told you I'd fix your little problem. Hope you saved enough for a good public defender." He was giddy. I could practically hear his smug, high-pitched laugh through the screen. He followed it with an email, CCing our parents and the family's lead counsel, outlining his discovery of my supposed crimes. He claimed I had been siphoning money from our mother's healthcare trust to fund private investments. It was a lie so bold, so calculated to turn our parents against me, that it took my breath away. He was using the very accounts I had begged him to stop touching. For the next 72 hours, the messages didn't stop. Trevor was in a state of manic confidence. He sent me screenshots of the headlines he was leaking to the local business journals. "Hale family empire rocks by daughter's greed," one draft read. He followed up with a voice note, "Morgan, look, I'll make it easy. Admit you have a problem, sign over your remaining shares to the trust, which I'll manage, and I'll tell the judge we're handling it as a family medical issue. Otherwise, I'm going to destroy you in front of everyone. I'll make sure you can't get a job bagging groceries when I'm done." My phone vibrated until the battery died. I sat in the dark, the blue light of the last message fading. My mother sent a single text: "How could you do this to us? Do not call your father. His heart broken." Trevor had done it. He had created a reality where he was the savior protecting the family from a predatory sister. He was so sure of his victory that he began sending me advice on which prisons were the least violent. He was mocking me, dancing on what he thought was my grave before the first shovelful of dirt had even been tossed. Every instinct I had told me to scream, to call my mother and tell her that Trevor was the one who bought the Porsche with her medical funds, to send the bank statements showing his signature on the wire transfers. But I didn't. I didn't reply to a single text. I didn't defend myself in the family group chat. I didn't even call a lawyer. I simply plugged my phone in, opened a secure cloud drive, and uploaded the screen recordings of his threats. Trevor thought my silence was a sign of a collapse. He thought I was paralyzed by fear. He didn't realize that in a legal war, the first person to talk is usually the one with the most to hide. I let him keep typing. I let him build the evidence of his own malice, one arrogant text at a time. Trevor's confidence wasn't just born from ego. It was built on a foundation of meticulously crafted paper trails. He wasn't just lying. He was engineering a reality. His legal strategy was brilliant in its cruelty. He hadn't just accused me of taking money. He had created a fake debt narrative that made it look like I had been digging a hole for years. He presented a series of promissory notes and loan agreements, all bearing a digital signature that looked exactly like mine. According to these documents, I had borrowed over $4 million from the family's primary holding company to cover failed personal investments that didn't even exist. He had created shell companies with names similar to my actual consulting firm, moving money between them in a confusing web of transactions that would make any outside auditor's head spin. He knew that in a bankruptcy court, the person with the most organized binder usually wins. He had spent months preparing this trap. He'd manipulated internal memos, backdated emails, and even went as far as to have a witness, a disgruntled former IT contractor he'd bribed, ready to testify that I had asked for help bypassing security protocols on the family's main server. Trevor sat across from me in the pretrial meetings with a look of genuine pity, as if he were watching a sick animal limp toward its end. He was so sure of himself because he had the ultimate backup, our parents. Elias and Beatrice weren't just supporters, they were the fuel for his fire. They had already signed affidavits confirming Trevor's version of events, claiming they had noticed erratic behavior and secretive spending from me for years. They reinforced his confidence by treating his lies as gospel and my existence as a stain they couldn't wait to scrub away. My father had even told the family's old estate lawyer, "Trevor is the only one with the head for this. Morgan has always been fragile. We just didn't realize how far she'd gone." Hearing those words through a leaked memo didn't break me, it hardened me. It made me realize that the quiet, observant daughter they thought they knew was someone they had never actually bothered to see. They saw a scapegoat because it was convenient. Trevor felt invincible because he had successfully turned my silence into a confession in their minds. He believed that because I wasn't shouting from the rooftops or filing frantic countersuits, I had no cards left to play. He thought I was drowning in the complexity of the fake debt he'd built. What he didn't know was that I was using every second of his peacocking to finish my own work. While he was out at expensive lunches with his legal team, bragging about how he was going to reclaim the empire, I was sitting in my dark home office with a forensic accountant I'd hired using my own savings. Money Trevor didn't even know existed because it was from a small inheritance from my grandmother that I'd kept in a separate, private trust. We weren't just looking at the documents Trevor had manipulated, we were looking at the metadata. Every signed PDF he had created had a digital footprint. Every wire transfer he'd initiated left a trail that led back to his specific IP address, not mine. I was quietly gathering the original, unedited server logs that Trevor thought he had deleted. I was documenting the exact moments he had logged into my workstation while I was out of the office. He was building a house of cards on a windy pier, and he was so busy admiring the view that he didn't notice I was the one holding the fan. I stayed in the shadows, letting him feel the rush of absolute power, because a man who feels he cannot lose is a man who stops looking for his own mistakes. The week leading up to the final hearing was a masterclass in psychological warfare. I was a ghost in my own life. I'd walk into the local coffee shop and see people I'd known for years look away, their eyes suddenly glued to their phones. Trevor had done his job well. The rumors had spread through our social circles like a virus. I was already guilty in the court of public opinion. My phone was a graveyard of unanswered messages and blocked numbers. Even the local florist, a woman I'd bought birthday arrangements from for a decade, handled my credit card as if it were contaminated. The isolation was absolute, a cold, heavy blanket that settled over my shoulders and refused to lift. I spent those nights in the silence of my study, the only sound being the rhythmic clicking of my mouse as I sorted through years of data. Every click felt like a heartbeat. I kept thinking back to when we were kids, the way Trevor would break a vase and I'd be the one sent to my room because Morgan should have been watching him. Silence had been my survival tactic since I was 7. If I didn't complain, the punishment ended sooner. If I didn't argue, my father didn't raise his voice. I was trained to be a recipient of blame, a sponge for the family's friction. Trevor knew this. He relied on that childhood conditioning, betting everything that I would just take the hit and disappear into the night like I always had. But this time, the silence was different. It wasn't the silence of submission, it was the silence of a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. I stared at the screen, focused on the signatures. Names are powerful things. To my parents, the name Hale was a brand. To Trevor, it was a shield. But to me, in the world of forensic accounting, a name is just a series of data points. I looked at the digital signatures Trevor had forged. He was arrogant enough to use a template, a copy of my signature from a 2019 tax return. He'd pasted it onto dozens of fake loan documents, never realizing that my signature had subtly changed after I broke my wrist in a skiing accident 2 years ago. The loops were tighter now, their M more jagged. His proof was a carbon copy of a person who no longer existed. I looked at the numbers. $4,200,000. $150,000. $85,000. To the judge, these were figures of theft. To me, they were the exact amounts Trevor had lost on a failed cryptomining farm he'd hidden from our father. Every number told a story of his greed, not mine. I felt a strange, detached calm as I cross-referenced the metadata of his evidence with my own encrypted logs. The timestamps didn't lie. While he was claiming I was embezzling from my mother's trust, the server logs showed he was the one logged in from a luxury hotel in Vegas. He was so confident in my habit of being silenced that he hadn't even covered his tracks. He thought he was erasing me, but he was actually just providing the roadmap for his own destruction. I closed the laptop, the glow fading from my face, and for the first time in weeks, I slept. The courtroom felt smaller than it should have, the air thick with the scent of floor wax and the stale, recycled oxygen of bureaucracy. At the front of the room, perched behind a bench of dark, polished wood that seemed to absorb the light, sat Judge Miller. She was a woman who didn't need a gavel to command silence. Her presence was cold, academic, and terrifyingly neutral. She adjusted her glasses, her eyes scanning the room with the practiced detachment of someone who had seen every possible way a human being could fail. She didn't look at me with pity, and she didn't look at Trevor with favor. She was simply a scale, waiting to be tipped. Trevor's lawyer, a man named Marcus Vane, was already in motion. He was a performer who treated the courtroom like a theater, his voice projecting to the back of the gallery where my parents sat like statues. He paced the small gap between the tables, his expensive shoes clicking sharply against the linoleum. "Your Honor," he began, his tone a mix of sorrow and righteous indignation. "Today is a day of reckoning for the Hale family. We aren't just talking about a series of bad investments. We are talking about a daughter who looked at her family's legacy and saw a personal ATM. We are talking about a betrayal of the highest order." He gestured toward me, but I didn't move. I kept my gaze fixed on the empty space just above the judge's shoulder. Beside me, Trevor was a portrait of relaxed victory. He was leaning back, one arm draped over the empty chair next to him, his thumb tracing the edge of his jaw. He looked like a man who was attending a coronation, not a bankruptcy hearing. Every now and then, he would lean over to whisper something into his lawyer's ear, followed by a small, smug smirk that he didn't even try to hide. He was so relaxed he was almost bored. He had played this out in his head 1,000 times, and in every version, I was the one who broke down in tears, pleaded for mercy, and signed away my life. He was enjoying the spectacle, savoring the way the court reporter's fingers flew across the keys, recording my public execution for the permanent record. I remained a statue. I had worn a plain, charcoal grey suit, nothing that screamed wealth, nothing that pleaded for sympathy. I didn't have a team of high-powered attorneys. I had one local lawyer who I had instructed to remain silent unless I gave a specific signal. The atmosphere in the room was suffocating. I could hear the hushed whispers of the gallery, the shifting of bodies in the pews, and the occasional heavy sigh from my father. They were all waiting for the big reveal, the moment when the evidence of my greed would be laid bare and the judge would strip me of everything. The pressure was designed to make me snap, to make me stand up and scream that it wasn't fair. But I knew something Trevor didn't. In a room full of noise, the person who says the least is the only one who is actually listening. The judge cleared her throat, a sound like dry parchment rubbing together. The room went dead silent. She looked down at the stack of documents Vane had provided, Trevor's carefully curated lies. "Mr. Vane," she said, her voice cutting through the theatrical tension. "You've made some very serious allegations regarding the digital signatures on these loan agreements. You are asserting, under oath, that these are the authenticated marks of Morgan Hale." Vane didn't hesitate. He puffed out his chest and smiled. "Absolutely, Your Honor. They have been verified by our internal audit." Trevor's smile widened. He thought the trap was closed. He didn't see me reach into my folder. He didn't see the judge's eyes flicker toward me, waiting for the one thing Trevor hadn't prepared for, my response. The silence in the room was no longer a vacuum, it was a physical weight. Judge Miller leaned forward, her elbows resting on the bench as she peered over the rims of her glasses at the document Marcus Vane had just finished glorifying. She didn't look at Trevor, and she didn't look at my parents. She looked at a single page halfway through the thick binder of evidence. The atmosphere shifted instantly. The theatrical energy Vane had spent the last hour building began to leak out of the room like air from a punctured tire. Trevor's relaxed posture didn't change, but his eyes narrowed, tracking the judge's movements with a sudden, sharp intensity. "Mr. Vane," the judge said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. "I'm looking at Exhibit C-14. This is the primary loan agreement for the $4 million transfer from the Hale Trust to the offshore entity MH Global Holdings. You've testified that this document was signed by Morgan Hale on the afternoon of July 14th of last year. Is that correct?" Vane smoothed his hair, his smile widening with a touch of patronizing confidence. "That is correct, Your Honor. The digital timestamp and the IP log provided by the estate server confirm she was logged into the portal at exactly 2:14 p.m. from her primary residence." The judge nodded slowly, but it wasn't a nod of agreement. It was the nod of a person who had just seen a mouse step into a trap. She turned the page and then asked the one question that changed everything. "Then perhaps you can explain to this court how Morgan Hale managed to execute a digital signature from her home in Connecticut at 2:14 p.m., when the official FAA flight logs and customs records show she was on a non-WIFI-enabled transoceanic flight to London at that exact hour." The silence that followed wasn't just quiet, it was deafening. Vane's mouth stayed open for a second too long, the practiced retort dying on his tongue. He blinked, his eyes darting toward Trevor. I would have to check the time zone conversions, Your Honor," he stammered, his voice losing its theatrical resonance. "The server logs are very clear." "The server logs are digital, Mr. Vane," the judge interrupted, her voice like a guillotine. "Physical presence is not. I have a secondary filing here from the defense, submitted just 10 minutes ago, containing a certified copy of Ms. Hale's passport and a sworn affidavit from the airline. She was 30,000 feet over the Atlantic. So, I'll ask you again, who signed this document?" Beside me, I heard the sound of Trevor's chair creaking. The smug, relaxed tilt of his head vanished. He sat bolt upright, his face draining of color until he looked like a wax figure. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and burgeoning panic. He thought I had been doing nothing. He thought I was just sitting there, taking the hits. He hadn't realized that the quiet daughter had spent months waiting for him to pick a date, any date, where his arrogance would outpace his research. I didn't say a word. I didn't look at him. I just stared straight ahead, watching the shadow of the judge's gavel fall across his falsified evidence. His confidence didn't just crack, it shattered. The air in the courtroom didn't just feel thin anymore. It felt electric, like the moments right before a massive storm breaks. As the judge's question hung in the air, my lawyer finally stood up. He didn't need to be theatrical like Vane. He simply walked to the clerk's desk and handed over a slim, encrypted flash drive and a stack of color-coded folders. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "since the plaintiff's counsel is having trouble with the timeline, we'd like to submit the metadata analysis of the entire Hale Trust server. This includes the original, unedited IP logs that show every single Morgan Hale signature for the last year was actually generated from a device registered to Trevor Hale's private office. I finally turned my head. I didn't look for revenge. I looked for the truth. Trevor was no longer the golden son. He was a man drowning in his own lies. His hands were shaking so violently that he had to tuck them under the table. Beside him, Vane was frantically flipping through his binders, his face a blotchy, embarrassed red. The gallery was no longer whispering, it was dead silent, the kind of silence that happens when people realize they've been cheering for the wrong person. I saw my mother's face first. Her carefully applied makeup seemed to be cracking. She looked at Trevor, then at the judge, then finally, for the first time in years, she looked at me with an expression that wasn't disgust. It was horror. As the judge began reviewing the new documents on her screen, the financial truth started to pour out. It wasn't just about a flight to London. My lawyer walked the court through the shell companies Trevor had created. One by one, we showed that the $4.2 million I supposedly stole had never reached my accounts. Instead, every cent had been funneled into a series of high-stakes offshore gambling platforms and a failing luxury real estate development in the Caribbean, all of which were in Trevor's name. The debt I owed was actually Trevor's debt, meticulously rebranded with my name to save himself from our father's wrath. The unraveling of my parents was the hardest part to watch, yet the most necessary. My father, the man who valued the Hale name above all else, looked like he had aged 20 years in 20 minutes. He stared at the screen as it showed a text message Trevor had sent to an accomplice, which we had recovered from the server's backup. Don't worry about Morgan. She's a ghost. Dad will believe whatever I tell him, and she's too scared to fight back. We'll pin the 2024 losses on her and I'll be the one who saves the company. My father's breath hitched, a ragged, wet sound that cut through the room. The son he had championed had viewed his trust as a weakness to be exploited. The daughter he had sidelined was the only thing standing between the family and total ruin. The public humiliation that Trevor had engineered for me was now moving toward him like a tidal wave. The reporters in the back rows were no longer typing about the greedy daughter. Their fingers were flying as they documented the fall of the golden son. Trevor tried to speak, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched crack. It's not what it looks like, Dad. She's manipulating the data. She's always been jealous. But the judge didn't even look up from the screen. She raised one hand to silence him without even making eye contact. The reversal was absolute. The room was no longer a stage for my execution. It was the site of Trevor's exposure. I felt a strange sense of peace. I wasn't happy. There is no happiness in watching your family fall apart. But for the first time in my life, I was visible. The numbers didn't lie, and finally, neither did the Hales. The judge didn't wait for a closing statement. She didn't need to. The silence in the room was absolute as she looked at Trevor, her expression devoid of the pity he had tried so hard to manufacture for himself. Mr. Hale, she said, her voice echoing off the high ceilings, this court is not a playground for sibling rivalries, nor is it a tool for fraud. The evidence provided by the defense is not just exculpatory for Morgan Hale. It is a roadmap of your own criminal conduct. She didn't raise her voice, but the weight of her words felt like iron. She formally dismissed the bankruptcy filing against me and ordered the immediate freezing of all assets held in Trevor's name. She then did something I hadn't expected. She referred the case to the district attorney for a criminal investigation into perjury, embezzlement, and identity theft. Trevor didn't scream. He didn't even protest. He just slumped forward, his forehead nearly touching the table he had sat at so confidently an hour before. The golden boy was gone. In his place was a man who looked small, broken, and fundamentally empty. My parents were a different story. My mother had buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent, jagged sobs. My father sat perfectly still, staring at the back of Trevor's head as if he were looking at a stranger. The pride that had fueled him for decades had been replaced by a hollow, terrifying clarity. They hadn't just lost their money, they had lost the myth of their perfect family. They had traded their daughter for a son who was currently being escorted out of the room by court officers for questioning. I watched it all with a strange, clinical detachment. I expected to feel a rush of victory, a surge of adrenaline that comes with finally being proven right. But there was nothing but a cold, quiet clarity. I felt like a spectator watching the end of a very long, very exhausting movie. When Trevor was led past me, he didn't look up. He couldn't. The shame was finally his to carry, and it looked heavier than he ever imagined. My parents stayed in their seats, looking paralyzed, perhaps waiting for me to come to them, to offer comfort or an "I told you so." I did neither. I didn't celebrate, and I didn't offer a shoulder to cry on. You cannot fix a foundation that was built on sand. I simply gathered my manila folder, the one that had looked so pathetic at the start of the day, and tucked it under my arm. The room was full of noise now, lawyers whispering, reporters rushing for the exit, but I felt like I was standing in a vacuum. The truth was out, and it was the coldest thing I had ever felt. I walked out of the courthouse doors and into the sharp, midday sun. The air was crisp, smelling of exhaust and freedom. My phone, which had been a source of so much pain over the last few months, was buzzing in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a string of messages. My mother: "Morgan, please come to the house. We need to talk. We didn't know." My father: "I'm so sorry, Morgan. Let's fix this." I stared at the screen for a long moment. They didn't want to fix the relationship. They wanted to fix the PR disaster. They wanted the quiet daughter to come back and help them navigate the wreckage their golden son had left behind. I didn't reply. I didn't delete the messages, either. I just turned the phone off. I looked down at the sidewalk, realizing that for the first time in my life, I didn't have a role to play. I wasn't the shadow, the bookkeeper, or the scapegoat. I was just Morgan Hale. Behind me, I heard the heavy doors of the courthouse swing open again. I didn't look back to see if it was my parents or the media. I just started walking. Trevor thought he was destroying me by dragging me into the light, but he had actually done me a favor. He had severed the ties that I was too loyal to cut myself. He had tried to use the law to bury me, but the law had given me my life back. I walked past the high-end shops and the offices where the important people worked, feeling lighter with every step. I didn't have the family empire, and I didn't have the Hale prestige anymore. I was sure they'd be radioactive in business circles for years, but I had the one thing Trevor would never have: a clean conscience and a future that wasn't a lie. I reached the corner, flagged down a taxi, and told the driver to just drive. I didn't know where I was going yet, but as I looked out the window at the city blurring past, I finally let out the breath I'd been holding for 20 years. The silence wasn't a cage anymore. It was peace.